Delighted to join you all for Municon 2021 today. Thank you so much for the invitation. As Lori mentioned, I do a couple of different things which draws me into your orbit today, even though it might seem like my work feels really different than what you might do. I have been at the UW for about 20 years and teach about global issues, global literature, race, identity, and difference. I'm the author of a book called Beyond Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World. And as we will speak today, travel is about not just when you're going far away to Kenya or Nepal, but travel is any time that we are moving into a context in which somebody's life is unlike ours. So we can be right here at home and traveling in a variety of ways, right? I also am a part of the Humanities Washington Speakers Bureau, and my program for this year is called Tangled, The Politics of Hair, and it's an invitation to think about hair as a way to consider beauty, bias, and belonging. It's a really fun presentation, so if you're interested, please do take a look at Humanities Washington. And I also do quite a lot of racial equity and DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I work with small nonprofits, large companies, public agencies, educational institutions. I work with a range of people. Let's begin with a question that I ask you, please. What does it mean to do good work in your particular role? I know that conference attendees do a variety of different things, right, related to stormwater. And so as you think about this question, right, I invite you to really consider your particular role and your definition of good work. Could we do better work if we were more mindful of our unequal history and how we differently navigate the unequal present? You'll note that I ask quite a lot of questions. I will be asking you a lot of questions today, right? And so part of this keynote is an opportunity for us to lean into equity and to lean into questions and even ways of asking questions that we might be a bit new to, right? So good work and what better work? I'm not saying more work. I'm not saying work harder, right? I'm sure many of you do good work. Many of you work quite hard. I'm asking, how do we parse out what good work is and what better work is in terms of equity, right? So leaning into equity, right, begins with this premise for me. And as I read this to you, I invite you again just to take a breath and to just kind of see how some of these statements land on you, right? History has not been fair to all. Historical advantages and disadvantages continue in our present. We want to pay attention to these historical and contemporary dynamics to rethink and revise how we do things, so more of us can enjoy richer, fuller, healthier lives. This last statement, right, is the why. So more of us can enjoy richer, fuller, healthier lives. And this that you have in front of you is my mission statement. I wrote this up some time ago, and it's a series of statements that I come back to over and over again, to help ground me and to help me think about why I do equity work, what my good work is, and how I can slowly transform my good work to better work in terms of equity, right? Again, I invite you to think about some of the premises from which you do your work, right? If you are wanting to lean into equity a bit more, or if you have already been leaning into equity for some time, right? What is the why for you? That last line for me, right, is so more of us can enjoy richer, fuller, healthier lives. What would that look like for you? Trying to link the why to our what is critical for us, right? This is our mission and vision statement, just like an organization. And I think this why is pretty critical for us to engage with because, frankly, we live in a society in which we are mostly engaged with people like us. Our communities, as we know, are more segregated than ever, right? We are more segregated as a nation than we were 30, 40 years ago. The bubbles that we are in, the political divisions in our country make it really challenging for us to move outside of communities who are just like us, right? And the opposite of the community that is just like me is totally unlike me, right? And we often work in a bifurcated system in these ways. And I invite you to think about the space in between, right? What is the space in between folks who I think are just like me and folks who I think are totally unlike me? How might I bridge that? The word "and" for me is such a powerful word. It's a very small word, but it does quite a lot of heavy lifting, right? It's a way to bridge these two parts of the dichotomy together, just like me and unlike me, and yet there's something in between that's bridging us, holding us together, right? So think about this image as you are considering good to better work, right? And trying to do better work means we're going to have to grapple with some of what comes up for us, right? What fears do we have when it comes to conversations about race, inequity, or history? How does it land on us? Why is it so complicated to do equity work, to do diversity, inclusion work, to ask hard questions? Right? Some of what I do in my own particular work really centers around this question. I work with a lot of well-intentioned people, people with sweet, good intentions about wanting to do better work, and yet are mired in a lot of fear and discomfort when it comes to having conversations about race and equity and history. And so I gently invite you to grapple with that fear, right? Equity work for me is not only about policies and procedures, it's also about attending to what's coming up for us, the internal ways that we have imbibed that just like us, or those are people so different from us, right? When we live in such a dichotomous culture, when we haven't been often taught about one another in productive, smart, and healthy ways, no wonder there's fear, no wonder there's nervousness, right? The nervousness and the fear is also present because many of us have a sense of this particular image, right? On the one hand, as you see on the right side, I'm good, I'm kind, I'm considerate, I'm well-intentioned, right? This is the understanding that we have ourselves. And it is true. You can be good, kind, and well-intentioned. We are so fearful often of raising questions about history, identity, and equity, right? Because we are so nervous that we will be told that we are bad, racist, sexist, classist, right? And we're not quite sure what to do with that, right? This is a tension that I see quite a lot in my work. And the fear and the discomfort of some of this prevents well-intentioned, good people from grappling and leaning into equity, right? So again, equity work is not just about fixing a policy, although let's fix our policies, right? Equity work is also about taking a breath, pausing a little bit and thinking, what's coming up for me, right? What's coming up for me? This image can be helpful for us, right? So on this left side, I am a good person. I'm kind, I'm considerate. And the other side of that is I cannot know everyone's experience. I might not be able to see all the nuance in front of me. And I've got some growing and reflecting to do. That and, right, that small word, that and can help us do that heavy lifting of both of these. Can we be good intentioned, considerate, and kind, and still have some growing to do, still have some stretching to do? Can both be possible at the same time, right? I have found in my work that when people have a lot more openness to welcome an and philosophy into their work and into their lives, we are more able, more capable to hold many different things at once, right? This is the journey of going from good to better work, right? Let's take a moment, right, and think about these terms that many of you use: overburdened and underserved, right? So let's just take a moment and think through this. Overburdened, right? Let's kind of focus on burdened. Burden means what, right? Feel free to use the chat. I've got the chat up in front of me, right? Burden means what to you? I'm going to ask you a series of questions here, right? Meant to spur your thinking and meant to inspire some thoughts in you, right? Burden means what, right? Burden doesn't mean what, right? There's a weight, there's a load, overloaded, right? And I'd like you to kind of even dig into that a little bit further, right? Burdened by what? Not just what the definition of burden means, but burdened by what? Right? Part of leaning into the equity is really taking a pause, slowing down, right? We often think sometimes that equity work means we need to do even more quickly, urgently. And while it is exceptionally urgent that we grapple with some of this, right? The way to do equity work in my book is to take some very intentional steps to slow down and actually look at what it is that we are trying to do from a wider lens, right? If we are not even sure what the term overburdened and underserved means, how are we supposed to make life better for more of us, right? This is what I see in a lot of my work, yeah? So there's quite a lot of statements that you all are making in the chat, right? What burden means to you and where the burden comes from, right? What about when we look at the term underserved, right? Served means to be, to be, of course, to be served, right? But it's also about our relationship as public workers. It's also about our relationship in terms of what that good work means in our particular position, right? How it means to serve. So when you think about the term underserved, right, are there some words or phrases that come up for you? Please do put them in the chat for us, right? Who has been working for which communities? Which communities have been overserved, right? These words over and under are often talked about only in one way. So even when we look at overburdened communities, what would underburdened communities look like, right? When we talk about underserved communities, what are overserved communities? We often don't think about equity in terms of that. We think about equity in terms of lack. We often don't think about equity work in terms of who has had access to more, right? That too is a part of the long history that we are trying to unravel and unpack. And it's important for us to note, right, that you or I did not create the unequal world that we are in now. I did not create it. You did not create it. And yet, you and I are both living in a world that has been structured historically for the last many hundreds of years, and from which those boundaries and binaries are playing out now unfairly, right? So on the one hand, you and I are exempt from having to do everything because I didn't do it and you didn't do it. And yet, if I am trying to, and you are trying to move your good work towards better work, right, by leaning into equity a bit more, right, what's the opportunity for us? We know some of the complexities, right? We're going to have to kind of grapple with our nervousness to have these conversations. We'll have to build those muscles a bit more for us and with our teams. We might have to say, I'm not quite sure of the right words to use, but something's coming up for me that I'd like to share with you all, right? I haven't read too much on this, but I'm wondering this, right? So we'll have to get more comfortable saying things like that out loud, right? And we'll also have to get better at being able to take a look at words like overburdened and underserved from a wider lens, right? Overburdened, once again, underburdened, underserved, right? And overserved, right? These kinds of very small nuances in language helps me really slow down a little bit, right? It helps me take the things that I have often taken for granted, and it helps me see it from a different light, right? Helps me see it from a different angle, yeah? So let me share with you a few ways that we can really dig in, right? We can dig in. And these are several questions that might be really helpful for you and for your teams as you are thinking about good work to better work toward equity, right? What are the power imbalances between you and the overburdened and underserved community that we are thinking about, right? Power imbalances is not just you have and they have less, right? But where do these power imbalances come from? How long-standing are they? How do they play out in your interactions, right? The second comment that I have here, it's not just how nice you are as an individual. Oftentimes, we are seen as the government, right? Again, our niceness as an individual is somehow secondary. It's important. I hope you are nice. Please continue to be nice, right? But simply being nice or simply saying, but I'm good as a person, right, sometimes keeps us unaware of how others might be seeing us, right? And this is a really important question for us to be asking. What are the assumptions that folks are operating from? You and I meet, right? We think that we're on the same page, but if we're not, right? So what are those assumptions? And just like that first question about power imbalances, we can ask even more questions. Where do those assumptions come from, right? Why is it really important to be aware of how others are imagining us? It's really good for us to think about how we are coming toward others, because we have a lot of baggage ourselves. It's not just that the community is thinking things about us, we are also thinking things about them. How could we not? In such a world in which we have so little contact with people who are unlike us, many of us are operating from all kinds of assumptions about one another, right? So everybody in this circuit is operating from particular assumptions, right, that stem from this unequal history that you and I are a part of that is in operation now. So you can tell that some of these are really big questions that will require us to slow down, be more intentional, have a little bit of courage with one another, to have these conversations before we are entering a community, while we are engaged with the community, right? We might also want to think about how we are perceived, and how that influences the project, right? The project is never, ever what is simply in a scope or in a contract, right? We imagine it is simply what is in a scope or a contract. All projects, everything that we do is also about all the human stuff that we bring to that piece of paper, right? It's about assumptions on each other. It's about the history. It's about the trust or lack of trust that we have, right? So how can we use those pieces of paper in addition to some of this cultural competence work that we're doing here, right? Some of that leaning into equity work that makes that piece of paper have more life to it, right? Because it's happening. Whether we say it or not, all these ideas are playing out, right? Anytime that we are signaling a overburdened or an underserved community, all of these issues are playing out, right? So it's up to us as we are engaging in these communities, right, to be able to slow down, have more spaces in our project timeline to be able to have these conversations with one another, right? Money and power can often dampen honesty, especially across hierarchy. No? I invite you to consider, how are you making space for honest conversation? What are some of the challenges to honest conversation, right? Wanting to do something is one thing, but trying to understand why it's so challenging can be really helpful for us, right? I want to be more comfortable, you might be thinking, in conversations about race and equity. That's great. And while you are leaning toward that, I also invite you to think of what makes conversations about race and equity uncomfortable, right? That can be a really amazing counterpoint for our learning. So if you're trying to have more conversations that are honest, right, it's good for us to think about it from a different angle, right? What makes conversations less honest? What are some of the forces that make it complicated for us to be honest with one another, right? And this last question is something I've been asking you, right? How will you build in time and space within your project and your team to be both open to and mindful of these issues, right? Leaning into equity, let me be really clear, is not about knowing how to solve everything all the time. I wish I could solve everything all the time. I wish you could too. Leaning into equity work is knowing that you and I are operating from a long history of inequity that is once again playing out right now. Leaning into equity is knowing that in small and intentional ways, we've got some opportunities to rethink how we do things, right? No magic wand. I have no magic wand. Perhaps you don't either. But I do have the courage and the fortitude to know that with the colleagues that I work with, I can ask some hard questions, and we've got some trust and camaraderie between us where we know these are important questions to ask. We might not know how to fix it all, right? But we know as a team, it is critical to be asking questions over and over again, right? What are the assumptions we're going in with? Where do those assumptions come from? How might the community that we are looking to partner with also be operating from assumptions? Where do their assumptions come from? Do we have trust? I don't think we could have trust when we have such hierarchies, right? In those moments, we're just saying things out loud, right? When we say things out loud, we take away some of its power, right? We put it into the realm of what is here in front of us instead of acting in silence, right? Saying things out loud is a very powerful way to lean toward equity, lean into equity, right? These questions will be available as well as this brief talk for you on your conference website. And so I encourage you and your team to go back and to write some of these questions down for you as a bit of a roadmap to have some conversations between your team members, right? I'll pause here. My contact info is right here for us. I want to make sure that we've got some time for questions before our small time is up. Thank you. Please, we've got a couple minutes. Anybody have a question, something that you'd like to share? Please do put it in the chat.
We do have about 5 minutes for questions, and Dr. Anu is a wealth of information. This is a fantastic opportunity to get your questions answered, as she has asked us to start having questions. We have a question. How can we be successful in addressing changing lack of diversity, inequalities, and exclusion in our society without naming and dismantling white supremacy and systemic racism oppression?
I think this is a great question. And just like I shared right at the end, we will have to be able to name things, right? We will have to be able to name things in order to shift, right? Some of these terms have a lot of weight to them, right? Some of us aren't quite sure what white supremacist norms mean, or we're not quite sure what systemic racism or oppression means. So I think at the first level, we're going to need to have some really gentle education for one another about what these terms mean and how they're being used these days, right? So that's one. Number two, if we want to make change, right? Just like I said, if we're trying to be more honest with the community, but we realize something's happening, we're going to have to think about why the dishonesty becomes important for us to understand. To do something better, we're going to have to think about what is actually in operation now. So we will need very thoughtful, gentle, inviting conversation so folks can grapple. Absolutely, right?
And we have just about a minute left. Do you have any advice for more junior employees on how to engage with these topics in the workplace?
Oh, that's a great question. We should spend all day talking about this, right? Strategies to get folks on board. You know, I have worked in a variety of institutions, and some of the most successful strategies that I have seen are when we are able to think about our passion and our purpose and align it with the mission of our work. So when I ask you, what is good work for you and what would better work look like, if you are able to articulate that with your colleagues and with your supervisors, I have seen teams become much more accountable to issues of equity. So then it's not just, oh, Anu wants to do that on her own, but it's Anu is really thinking about how issues of equity fit our work as a team, right? That's some of the strategies that I've seen. We are going to need a variety of strategies to do this work. Once again, this is hundreds of years old, isn't it? Hundreds of years old of work that you and I are trying to slowly unpack and dismantle, right? We're going to need a variety of strategies to do this work well, right? I see lots of great questions. We need another 3 hours, don't we?
We do. Dr. Anu, I will collect these questions and send them to you so that you can answer them, and we will post your responses with your slides and the recording on the conference website. I want to thank you again for a great conversation and helping give us direction and things to think about as we move forward in doing this work. Thank you so much for taking time to be here at Municon. It was a pleasure.
Thank you all. Best wishes to you.